The silence was the first thing that felt wrong. Not the quiet I cultivated, the peaceful hush of my small apartment where the ticking of the clock and the hum of the refrigerator were my familiar companions, but a dead, hollow silence. It was the kind that follows a storm, thick with the smell of splintered pine from my shattered front door and the sharp, metallic scent of fear. My fingers traced the raised dots of the Braille edition on the floor beside me, the familiar patterns a useless anchor in a world that had been violently upended. I could hear the city breathing outside my broken window, the distant wail of a siren growing closer, but inside, the air was stagnant, heavy with the ghosts of their movements. They had overturned everything: the soft thud of my music stand, the glassy tinkle of a framed photo of my parents hitting the floor, the rough scrape of my piano bench being dragged across the hardwood. I sat perfectly still amidst the wreckage, my hands resting in my lap, listening to the chaos settle into a new, terrifying shape. My world had always been one of sounds and textures, and it was now screaming a story of violation that no one else seemed to hear. The arrival of the police was a clumsy intrusion, a cacophony of heavy boots crunching on broken glass and loud, impersonal voices that bounced off the bare walls. They talked about me as if I weren't there, a piece of evidence to be catalogued. Detective Milda's voice was gravelly with exhaustion and cheap coffee. "Miss Vance, can you describe them?" he asked, the question a pointless formality. I wanted to scream that I could describe the wheezing breath of one man, the way his cheap cologne couldn't quite mask the sour smell of sweat. I could describe the nervous, rhythmic jingle of keys in the other's pocket, a specific pattern of 3 light clicks and a heavy one. I could describe the texture of the rough canvas bag they'd shoved over my head. But these were not the details they wanted. They wanted eye color, height, things that were as foreign to me as a silent film. If you've ever felt completely and utterly unheard, like your truth doesn't fit into the neat little boxes the world provides, then maybe you understand the profound isolation of that moment. If this feeling resonates with you, I hope you'll stick with my journey. Subscribing to this channel and liking the video helps more people find these stories about finding a voice when it feels like no one is listening. A sudden shift in the atmosphere silenced the detective mid-sentence. The clumsy, shuffling energy of the uniformed officers tightened, pulling into a posture of deference. The air itself seemed to grow colder, crisper, as a new presence filled the doorway. I didn't need to see him to know he was different. His footsteps were nearly silent on my debris-strewn floor, the sound of expensive, soft-soled leather moving with a liquid grace that was utterly alien to the brutish chaos that had preceded him. He brought the scent of the cold night air in with him, a clean, sharp fragrance of wool and something subtle and expensive, like bergamot and cedar. It was a stark contrast to the stale air of my violated home. The police officers mumbled greetings, their voices suddenly pitched with an unfamiliar respect that bordered on fear. This was not a cop. This was not a landlord coming to survey the damage. This was power. It had a sound, a scent, a weight that pressed down on the room, commanding silence without uttering a single word. I tilted my head, my entire being focused on this new variable, this epicenter of the sudden, tense quiet that had just descended upon my life. He spoke, and the sound of his voice vibrated through the floorboards, a low, controlled baritone that seemed to absorb all other noise in the room. "Leave us," he said. It wasn't a request, it was a dismissal, absolute and final. I heard the shuffling retreat of the police, the click of the broken door being pulled into a semblance of closure, and then a new silence. This one was different. It was watchful, intelligent. He moved closer, stopping a few feet away. I could feel the heat radiating from his body, a steady, contained energy. He brought the scent of the cold night air in with him, a clean, sharp fragrance of wool and something subtle and expensive, like bergamot and cedar. It was a stark contrast to the stale air of my violated home. The police officers mumbled greetings, their voices suddenly pitched with an unfamiliar respect that bordered on fear. This was not a cop. This was not a landlord coming to survey the damage. This was power. It had a sound, a scent, a weight that pressed down on the room, commanding silence without uttering a single word. I tilted my head, my entire being focused on this new variable, this epicenter of the sudden, tense quiet that had just descended upon my life. He spoke, and the sound of his voice vibrated through the floorboards, a low, controlled baritone that seemed to absorb all other noise in the room. "Leave us," he said. It wasn't a request, it was a dismissal, absolute and final. I heard the shuffling retreat of the police, the click of the broken door being pulled into a semblance of closure, and then a new silence. This one was different. It was watchful, intelligent. He moved closer, stopping a few feet away. I could feel the heat radiating from his body, a steady, contained energy. "They asked you what you saw," he stated, his voice devoid of pity, filled only with a chilling pragmatism. "I'm asking you what you heard." The question struck me with the force of a physical blow. In a world that constantly reminded me of what I had lost, this man, this dangerous-sounding stranger, was the first person to ask about the strength I had gained. He acknowledged my reality, my perception, without question. I took a slow, shaky breath, the simple query unlocking a floodgate of details I had thought were useless, and for the first time since my world was torn apart, I felt a flicker of something other than fear. I felt seen. His name was Dante Moretti. He said it as if it were an afterthought, a minor detail in the larger equation he was solving in his head. The name meant nothing to me, but I filed away the sound of it, the hard consonants and smooth vowels. He listened without interruption as I recounted the sounds, the specific scrape of a particular brand of work boot on the fire escape, the muttered argument in which one of the men called the other Marco, the faint, tinny sound of a specific news radio station playing from a phone in one of their pockets. These were the details the police had brushed aside, but this man, Dante, absorbed them like a sponge. He stood so still as I spoke that I could hear the soft, rhythmic whisper of his cashmere coat sleeve brushing against his side with each controlled breath. It was then, as I replayed the auditory horror in my mind for him, that the final, crucial piece clicked into place. A name, whispered between the two intruders when they thought I was unconscious. A name they spoke with a mixture of anger and fear. It wasn't my name, it was his. This entire nightmare, the destruction of my sanctuary, my safety, it hadn't been about me at all. I was just collateral damage in a war I didn't know existed. A strange protective impulse surged through me, overpowering my fear. This man, this powerful stranger who had listened when no one else would, was walking into a trap, and I was the only one who held the map. I reached a trembling hand out into the space between us, my fingers making contact with the impossibly fine wool of his suit jacket. He didn't move, didn't even flinch at the unexpected contact. He simply stood there, a monolith of controlled force, allowing the touch. "They weren't here for me," I whispered, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. My voice was so low I wasn't sure he heard it, but the sudden, sharp intake of his breath told me he had. The air around him seemed to crystallize, to drop several degrees. They were angry. They said the job was a message. They said, "Moretti." I paused, letting the name hang in the charged silence between us. Then I delivered the final, devastating blow, the words that would forever bind my life to his. "They came for you first." In that instant, I felt it, a subtle tremor that ran through him, the freezing of a man who was never caught off guard. The predator had just realized he was also the prey. The silence that followed stretched into an eternity, thick and heavy with unspoken violence. He remained completely still for a full minute, and I imagined him processing my words, recalibrating a world that had just shifted beneath his feet. The city outside my window seemed to fade away, its ambient noise muted by the sheer intensity of the man standing before me. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he moved. I heard the soft click of a high-end smartphone being unlocked, followed by a string of rapid, guttural Italian. The words were foreign, but the tone was universal, a death sentence being issued. It was over in seconds. Another click, and the phone was gone. His attention returned to me, and the air crackled with a new purpose. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, dangerous rumble, the calm at the eye of a hurricane. The cool pragmatism was still there, but it was now underpinned by a dark current of something that sounded like personal responsibility, like a debt. "You can't stay here," he said, and the words were not a suggestion or a kindness. They were an edict. My old life, my quiet, independent existence, was officially over, and my only path forward led directly through him. He was right, of course, but admitting it felt like a surrender I wasn't prepared to make. My independence was the one thing I had rebuilt from the ashes of my old life, piece by painstaking piece. It was my armor, my identity. To let him strip that away was to become a victim all over again. "I can't just leave," I argued, my voice sounding thin and reedy even to my own ears. "This is my home, my work is here, my life." Even as I said the words, they tasted like lies. My home was a ruin, the scent of pine and dust a constant reminder of its violation. My life, the quiet, predictable rhythm of it, had been shattered. He remained silent, letting my weak protests hang in the air. His lack of argument was more potent than any threat. It was the silence of a man who knew the outcome was already decided, who was merely waiting for me to catch up to the grim reality he already inhabited. The first tremor of my collapsing world came an hour after he left, a clipped, unsympathetic voicemail from Mrs. Gable, the mother of my most promising piano student. Her daughter wouldn't be coming for lessons anymore. It wasn't safe. The word echoed in the hollow space of my apartment, a pronouncement of my new, contaminated status. The dominoes fell with sickening speed after that. 2 more students canceled the next day, their parents offering flimsy excuses that barely veiled their fear. My main source of income, transcribing complex orchestral pieces for a local university's music department, evaporated when my contact, Professor Albright, informed me that due to budget cuts, they wouldn't need my services for the foreseeable future. I could hear the lie in the slight tremor of his voice, the too quick cadence of his speech. The story of the break-in had spread, painting me not as a victim deserving of sympathy, but as a liability, a magnet for trouble. Then came the official notice, slipped under the splintered remains of my door. An eviction letter from the building's management company, a legitimate front for Dante Moretti's empire, I now realized. It cited property damage and a violation of the lease's safety clause. It was a cold, legalistic confirmation of what I already knew. The life I had so carefully constructed was being systematically dismantled, and there was absolutely nothing I could do to stop it. Every pillar of my existence had been kicked out from under me, leaving me in a terrifying freefall with no safety net in sight. Desperation became a frantic, buzzing energy in my chest. I spent hours on the phone, my fingers flying over the braille display of my screen reader, searching for help. Legal aid societies had waiting lists months long. Shelters were full, their resources stretched thin. Every call ended the same way, with a polite, regretful voice on the other end explaining the impossible bureaucracy I was up against. The system, the one I was supposed to trust, was a labyrinth of dead ends. The humiliation was a constant, bitter taste in my mouth. It peaked when my ex-boyfriend, Mark, showed up unannounced, drawn by the scent of my misfortune like a vulture to carrion. He'd heard what happened, he said, his voice oozing a proprietary concern that made my skin crawl. He suggested I could stay with him for a while, an offer layered with the unspoken expectation of resuming a relationship I had fought hard to escape. His presence was a suffocating reminder of another kind of danger, the insidious kind that masquerades as care. I sent him away, the act of defiance costing me the last of my emotional reserves, leaving me utterly alone and exposed in the wreckage of my apartment, the silence now filled with the sound of my own ragged breathing. He returned 3 days after the eviction notice arrived. There was no knock, just the subtle shift in air pressure as the door opened and closed, followed by those impossibly quiet footsteps. He found me on the floor, surrounded by my few packed boxes, the eviction notice lying beside me like a tombstone. I had been trying to feel the sheet music for Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, seeking solace in its familiar structure, but my fingers felt numb, disconnected. He didn't speak for a long time. I could hear the soft whisper of his breathing, steady and controlled, but I could also sense the change in him. The air around him was different, colder, sharper, charged with a tightly coiled fury. It wasn't directed at me. It was a silent, simmering rage aimed at the forces that had brought me to this point, at the injustice of my situation. When he finally moved, it was to pick up the eviction notice. I heard the faint crinkle of the paper in his hand, a sound that seemed to punctuate the utter failure of my attempts to survive on my own. He was witnessing the full scope of the damage, and his silence was a terrifying judgment on the world that allowed it to happen. "This is the offer," he said, his voice cutting through the stillness, devoid of any emotion except a stark, unyielding pragmatism. "My penthouse is the most secure private residence in this city. It has a music room with a grand piano. You will live there. Your expenses will be covered. Your safety will be absolute." I held my breath, waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the price of this gilded cage. "In exchange," he continued, his tone hardening slightly, "you will work for me. The men who did this, they are careless. They believe you are a weakness, a blind girl who saw nothing. But you heard everything. I need to know what you heard. Every sound, every word, every whisper they thought was lost in the chaos. You will become my eyes, Miss Vance, in a way no one else can." The proposition was breathtaking in its audacity. He wasn't offering charity, he was offering a contract. He wanted to weaponize my senses, to turn the very thing that made me a target into his greatest asset. It was a deal that promised survival, but demanded I step fully into his dark, violent world, a place from which there would be no easy return. My pride, battered and bruised as it was, roared back to life. "No," I said, the word sharp and final. I pushed myself up, my body trembling with a mixture of fear and indignation. "I am not your asset, Mr. Moretti. I am not some listening device you can deploy at will. I will not trade my apartment for a cage, no matter how luxurious. You think because my life is falling apart, I'll simply surrender my will to you? You're wrong." The words tumbled out, fueled by the terror of becoming completely dependent on this powerful, dangerous man. "This is your world, your war. I was just in the way. Don't pretend this is about anything other than cleaning up your own mess and using me as a tool to do it. I would rather sleep on the street than become your pawn." I faced the direction of his voice, my head held high, my hands clenched at my sides. For a moment, there was only the sound of my own defiant heartbeat hammering in my ears, a desperate, final stand for the person I used to be before my world was torn apart by his enemies. I was choosing freedom, even if that freedom meant having nothing left to lose. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't move closer. He simply let my defiance hang in the air for a moment before dismantling it with cold, brutal facts. "Your pride is a luxury you can no longer afford, Alara," he said, using my first name for the first time, the sound of it on his lips both intimate and chilling.
The man who ordered the attack is Ricardo Fabri. He doesn't leave loose ends. He enjoys making examples of people. Detective Miller's case on your assault was closed this morning. The official report lists it as a random burglary, perpetrator unknown.
The system you believe in has already forgotten you. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. Fabri did this to send me a message that I cannot protect what is mine. He believes you are mine now. Your refusal to accept my help will not be seen as an act of independence. It will be seen as my failure, and he will come back to prove his point. I once watched someone die because I believed they were strong enough to stand alone. It was a mistake I will not repeat. His voice was flat, devoid of self-pity, but I could hear the ghost of an old agony beneath the surface, the source of his rigid, unbending code. The finality of his argument was punctuated by a sound from the street below, the low, guttural rumble of a car engine, one that didn't belong in my quiet neighborhood. It idled for a moment, then shut off. Silence. A few seconds later, I heard the soft, almost imperceptible click of my building's front door opening and closing. Dante hadn't moved, but I could feel the tension in him skyrocket. His stillness became predatory. He pulled out his phone, a quiet series of taps, and then he held it up. A voice, tinny through the speaker but clear, came from one of his men downstairs. "Boss, we have a delivery, a gift basket at the front door, addressed to Miss Vance." My blood ran cold. It wasn't the words themselves, but the chilling implication. They knew I was still here. They were watching. Fabri wasn't just a name anymore. He was a presence, a tangible threat that had just breached the final perimeter of my crumbling sanctuary. Dante didn't need to say anything else. The choice had been an illusion all along. There was no negotiation, no middle ground. There was only his world or a shallow grave. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, a ragged, shuddering sigh of defeat. The fight was gone, extinguished by the cold, hard reality of the gift basket sitting downstairs. It was a message wrapped in a threat, a promise of what would come if I remained. I gave a single, sharp nod, a gesture he somehow seemed to perceive in the charged silence. "Okay," I whispered, the word feeling like a betrayal of every principle I held dear. He didn't respond with triumph or relief, only with a quiet efficiency that was somehow more terrifying. He made a call, his instructions spoken in rapid Italian, low and decisive. Within minutes, 2 men, as silent and imposing as he was, were in my apartment. They moved with a practiced grace, packing my remaining belongings with a speed and care that was unnerving. I stood by my piano, my fingers tracing the cool, smooth surface of the ivory keys one last time. I was leaving behind more than an apartment. I was leaving behind Ilara Vance, the independent woman. As I walked out the door, stepping into the hallway and toward the life Dante Moretti had chosen for me, I felt the profound, irreversible shift. The door to my old life closed behind me, its final click sealing my fate. The penthouse was less a home and more a statement of cold, untouchable power. It was a cavern of glass and steel perched atop the city, so high up that the familiar sounds of the streets were a distant, muted roar. The air was different here, filtered and sterile, carrying only the faint, clean scent of ozone from the advanced climate control systems, and the subtle, lingering fragrance of Dante's bergamot and cedar cologne that seemed to have seeped into the very walls. My footsteps echoed on polished marble floors, each sound amplified in the vast, minimalist spaces. There were no soft textures to absorb the noise, no cluttered corners to offer comfort. He had shown me to the music room, where a magnificent Steinway grand piano sat like a black, glossy beast, its keys cold and unfamiliar beneath my tentative fingers. This was my gilded cage. The rules were simple and absolute, delivered by his head of security, a man named Leo, whose voice was surprisingly gentle for someone who moved with such heavy authority. I was not to leave the apartment, ever, not with him, and certainly alone.
My fierce, hard-won independence was the first casualty of my new life, a ghost that haunted the silent, echoing halls of my luxurious prison. My new work began the following morning in Dante's study, a room that felt like the heart of his empire. Unlike the rest of the penthouse, this space was warm with the scent of old books, worn leather, and the rich aroma of freshly brewed espresso. He sat me in a supple leather chair across from his massive desk, and without a word, played a recording. It was a cacophony of noise, the clatter of dishes in a restaurant, muffled conversation, the distant wail of a siren, captured by some hidden device. He commanded, his voice a low rumble. Ignore the obvious. Listen to what's underneath. He wanted me to sift through the auditory garbage and find a single incriminating grain of truth. I felt a surge of resentment at being used like a piece of high-tech surveillance equipment, but a darker, more pragmatic part of me was intrigued. I closed my eyes, letting the sounds wash over me, dissecting them layer by layer. And then I found it, a faint, repetitive pattern hidden beneath the chatter. A nervous, three-part cough, followed by a sharp intake of breath. It was distinctive, almost a signature. "There," I whispered, "someone has a cough. It's not random."
It's a nervous habit. The silence that followed was heavy with his unvoiced assessment. Life settled into a strange, suffocating routine. Dante was a phantom in his own home, his presence a constant, watchful pressure, even when he was rooms away. The days were marked by the silent delivery of meals prepared by an unseen chef, each one nutritionally perfect and utterly devoid of personality. One evening, after being presented with a plate of steamed sea bass and asparagus that smelled of nothing but polite restraint, something inside me snapped. It was a small rebellion, but it felt like a declaration of war. I stood up and announced I was going to the kitchen to make myself some pasta. Leo, my ever-present shadow, materialized in the doorway, blocking my path. "I'm sorry, Miss Vance. Mr. Moretti prefers the staff to handle all food preparation." His voice was apologetic but firm. I argued, my voice rising with a frustration that had been simmering for days. I needed to do something for myself, to feel the familiar shape of a wooden spoon, to smell garlic sizzling in olive oil. Just as the standoff reached a tense impasse, Dante's voice cut through the air from down the hall. "Let her, Leo." It wasn't permission, it was a concession, a crack in the marble facade of his control. The kitchen was an industrial marvel of stainless steel and silent high-end appliances, but I quickly made it my own. I found flour, yeast, eggs, and soon my hands were deep in dough, the familiar, comforting motions grounding me in a way nothing else had since my world fell apart. I was humming an old Italian folk song my mother used to sing, lost in the simple, tactile pleasure of creating something, when his voice startled me from directly behind. "That smells good." I hadn't heard him approach. He moved with an unnatural silence that was perpetually unnerving. I jumped, and a dusting of flour puffed from my hands onto the front of my dark sweater. "You should wear a bell," I retorted, my heart thumping. He didn't respond to the jibe. Instead, I heard a soft rustle of fabric, and then his fingers, warm and calloused, brushed against my cheek. He was so gentle, his touch feather-light, as he wiped away a smudge of flour I hadn't realized was there. The gesture was so shockingly tender, so completely at odds with the cold, dangerous man I knew, that it stole the air from my lungs. The brief contact left my skin tingling long after he had retreated back into the shadows of his silent apartment. Dante's mother, Sophia, was a force of nature. She arrived one afternoon like a summer storm, her voice a rich, melodic contralto that filled the sterile penthouse with warmth and life. She carried the scent of expensive perfume and freshly cut roses, and her presence immediately dwarfed her sign's brooding silence. She spoke to me not with pity, but with a sharp, assessing curiosity, her questions about music and literature revealing a formidable intellect.
We were having tea in the vast living room when she casually dropped a bomb into the conversation. "It's so interesting the people one runs into," she mused, her tone light. "I saw Riccardo Fabri at a charity gala last night. A dreadful man. He asked after Dante, and then he asked very specifically about the beautiful new guest my son was keeping so carefully hidden away." The name, Fabri, hung in the air, a venomous, living thing. My blood ran cold. The monster who had ordered my life destroyed was no longer a faceless entity. He was a society man who attended galas and inquired about me by name. I felt Sophia's gaze on me, and I knew this wasn't just idle gossip. It was a warning, delivered by the queen of this violent, glittering kingdom. That night, sleep was an impossibility. The name Fabri echoed in my mind, a drumbeat of fear. I found my way to the music room, the polished keys of the grand piano cool beneath my trembling fingers. I began to play, not a soft nocturne, but a frantic, discordant piece of my own creation, pouring all my terror and rage into the music. The notes crashed and splintered in the cavernous room, a soundtrack to my unraveling sanity. I didn't know how long I played before I sensed him there, a silent statue in the doorway. When the final jarring chord faded into silence, he spoke, his voice a low murmur in the dark. "My father thought Fabri was his brother. He grew up in our home, ate at our table. The day he betrayed my father, he brought him a bottle of his favorite wine as a gift." He paused, and the weight of his family's history filled the space between us. "In my world, Alara, there is no greater sin than betrayal. Fabri didn't just kill my father, he destroyed the idea of trust. He taught me that attachment is a weapon that will always be used against you." It was a confession, a glimpse into the wound that had forged him into the cold, solitary man he was. A few days later, a new kind of message arrived. It wasn't a phone call or a piece of intelligence for Dante. It was for me. Leo brought it, his voice tight with a concern he couldn't quite hide. It was a small, lightweight box wrapped in plain brown paper. Dante was gone, tied up in meetings downtown. My hands trembled as I tore it open. Inside, nestled on a bed of black tissue paper, was a single white gardenia, perfectly formed, its scent thick and cloying. It was the same flower from the threatening gift basket at my old apartment. My stomach churned.
Beneath the flower was a single folded note. I fumbled for my phone, my screen reader turning the printed words into a synthesized, chilling whisper in my ear. A cage is still a cage. A protector who cannot see the enemy within his own walls is no protector at all. The words confirmed my deepest fear. Fabri wasn't just outside, laying siege to the fortress. He had a key. He had someone on the inside. The impenetrable walls of my gilded cage suddenly felt as fragile as glass, and the air I was breathing tasted of poison and betrayal. When Dante returned hours later, I could hear the exhaustion in his footsteps. I met him at the door, holding out the box and the note. He took them without a word. I felt the atmosphere in the penthouse shift, the temperature dropping as his controlled fury began to radiate from him in silent, lethal waves. There was a sharp crack as his hand tightened, crushing the small box in his fist. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The venom was in the chilling quiet that followed. "Leo," he said, his voice barely a whisper, but it carried the command of a king ordering an execution. His consigliere appeared instantly, his own expression grim. "The floral delivery," Dante stated, his words clipped and precise. "It came through the service entrance this morning. Who was on duty?" Leo's hesitation was telling. "Antonio, boss. He's been with us for 5 years." Dante's reply was devoid of any emotion, which made it all the more terrifying. "Find him. Find out what Fabri promised him. Then take him to the warehouse and make it clear to everyone what happens when you bring the enemy into my home." The message was clear,
A line had been crossed, and the price for that treason would be paid in blood. The brutal reality of my situation became undeniable later that night. I was standing near the massive wall of windows, listening to the distant pulse of the city, when the sound ripped through the air. It wasn't a car backfiring or a firework. It was the sharp, percussive crack of a high-powered rifle, a sound designed to announce its deadly intent. It was followed almost instantly by the explosive shatter of glass from far below. The windows of the penthouse were untouched, but the message had been delivered. Dante was across the room in a heartbeat, his body a solid wall as he pulled me away from the glass, shielding me. "Get down," he growled, his voice a low, guttural command. Leo was already on his phone, barking orders to the security team downstairs. "What was that?" I breathed, my hands pressed against the hard muscle of Dante's chest. Who did they shoot? He hesitated for a fraction of a second, and in that silence, I knew the answer was something terrible. "They didn't shoot anyone," he said, his voice grim and laced with a cold, simmering rage. "That was the windshield of the doorman's car, the man who let Antonio clear the delivery. Fabry is showing me he knows who is loyal. He's showing me that anyone who helps you, anyone who protects you, is now a target." The message was clear. A line had been crossed, and the price for that treason would be paid in blood. The brutal reality of my situation became undeniable later that night. I was standing near the massive wall of windows, listening to the distant pulse of the city, when the sound ripped through the air. It wasn't a car backfiring or a firework. It was the sharp, percussive crack of a high-powered rifle, a sound designed to announce its deadly intent. It was followed almost instantly by the explosive shatter of glass from far below. The windows of the penthouse were untouched, but the message had been delivered. Dante was across the room in a heartbeat, his body a solid wall as he pulled me away from the glass, shielding me. "Get down," he growled, his voice a low, guttural command. Leo was already on his phone, barking orders to the security team downstairs. "What was that?" I breathed, my hands pressed against the hard muscle of Dante's chest. Who did they shoot? He hesitated for a fraction of a second, and in that silence, I knew the answer was something terrible. "They didn't shoot anyone," he said, his voice grim and laced with a cold, simmering rage. "That was the windshield of the doorman's car, the man who let Antonio clear the delivery. Fabry is showing me he knows who is loyal. He's showing me that anyone who helps you, anyone who protects you, is now a target." The illusion of safety was a fragile, beautiful thing. Dante had arranged for a private dinner at Il Silenzio, a restaurant he owned, a place he described as a fortress disguised by silk tablecloths and the scent of truffle lil. For the first time in weeks, I felt a semblance of normalcy. The low hum of contented diners, the gentle clinking of wine glasses, and the soft strains of a string quartet created a warm, protective bubble. Dante sat across from me, a silent, powerful presence, but tonight his silence felt different, less guarded, more companionable. He described the painting on the wall opposite us, a vibrant Venetian street scene, his words painting a picture in my mind with surprising detail and a hint of wistful nostalgia. "There's a man in the corner," he murmured, his voice a low rumble just for me, "selling flowers. My father always said he had the saddest eyes in all of Venice." In that small, shared observation, I felt the walls around him thin, just for a moment, and I allowed myself to believe that perhaps, in this carefully controlled world, we could actually be safe. The thought was a dangerous luxury, a fleeting moment of peace before the storm I should have known was coming. The first sound that was wrong was the heavy, metallic thud of the main oak doors being barred from the outside, a sound that cut through the restaurant's gentle symphony with brutal finality. A collective gasp rippled through the room, followed by a sudden, chilling silence. Then the shattering of the large front windows, an explosive cascade of glass that rained down on the diners near the entrance. Screams erupted, a chaotic chorus of terror. Before I could even process the sounds, Dante was moving. His chair scraped back violently, and his hand was on my arm, pulling me down under the heavy table. His body became a shield over mine, solid and unyielding. "Stay down," he commanded, his voice a lethal whisper against my ear. I could hear them now, the heavy, confident footsteps of men who were not guests, their voices harsh and mocking as they moved through the panicked crowd. I recognized the wheezing laugh of one of the men who had been in my apartment. They weren't just here to cause chaos. They were hunting. And I knew, with a certainty that turned my blood to ice, that they were hunting for me. The next few minutes were a blur of auditory violence.
I heard the sickening impact of fists on flesh, the grunts of men fighting, the crash of tables and chairs being used as weapons. Through it all, Dante's breathing remained steady, a controlled rhythm in the heart of the chaos. His men, the silent shadows, who were always just out of sight, had engaged the attackers, creating a perimeter of brutal efficiency. Now, Dante breathed, his hand tightening on mine. He pulled me up and we moved, fast and low, through the wreckage. The air was thick with the smell of spilled wine, fear, and something else, the sharp, coppery scent of blood. He guided me with a series of low commands and physical pressures, a language of survival we had developed without words. We navigated through the swinging doors of the kitchen, the sounds of the main dining room fading behind us, replaced by the panicked shouts of the staff. He didn't let go of my hand, his grip an unbreakable promise as he led us into the cold, damp air of a back alley. He was moving with a stiff, unnatural gait, and the scent of blood was stronger now, clinging to him like a second skin. He took me to an anonymous apartment in a part of town that smelled of rain-soaked concrete and exhaust fumes, a place that clearly served as a bolt hole. It was small and impersonal, furnished with only the barest essentials. The moment the door clicked shut behind us, the adrenaline that had sustained me evaporated, leaving me trembling. "You're hurt," I stated, my voice flat. I could hear the faint, wet sound of his sleeve sticking to his skin as he moved his arm. "It's nothing," he deflected, his tone dismissive. But I stepped closer, my hands reaching out until I found his arm. He flinched, a sharp, involuntary intake of breath that told me everything. "Let me," I insisted, my voice softer now. I guided him to a chair and found a small first aid kit in the bathroom, my fingers quickly identifying the antiseptic wipes and bandages by touch. As I carefully cleaned the gash on his forearm, a long, shallow cut from a knife, he was unnervingly still. He let me tend to him, his powerful body surrendering to my care in the quiet intimacy of the sterile room, a silent admission of a vulnerability he would never voice. He broke the silence as I was taping the bandage in place, his voice rough with an emotion I couldn't quite decipher. "There was a girl," he began, the words sounding as if they were being torn from him. "My cousin, Isabella. She was like you, stubborn, independent. She refused to listen when I told her she was in danger. She said she wouldn't live in a cage." He paused, and I could hear the ghost of an old, raw pain in the quiet rhythm of his breathing. Fabri's father was making a move against my family. He saw her as a message to be sent. They took her from her university library. By the time we found her, it was too late. The story landed in the small room with devastating weight, explaining everything about him, his suffocating control, his pathological need for security, his fear of attachment. "I see her in you, Alara," he whispered, his voice cracking on the final word. "Every time you fight me, every time you talk about freedom, I see her, and I will not fail again." He wasn't just protecting me from Fabri, he was trying to save himself from the ghost of a failure that had defined his entire life. His confession was a key, unlocking a door inside me I had kept bolted for years. I finished with the bandage, my fingers lingering on his arm for a moment longer than necessary. "The day of my accident," I began, my own voice a low murmur. I was awake. After the impact, I was trapped in the back seat. I could hear everything. I could hear my father trying to talk to my mother, his voice getting weaker. I could hear the first responders outside the car, saying they couldn't get the doors open. I could smell the gasoline. Tears I hadn't shed in years began to trace hot paths down my cheeks. I just laid there, listening to them die, completely and utterly helpless.
My independence, Mr. Moretti, it's not about pride. It's about a promise I made to myself in that darkness, that I would never, ever be that helpless again. I would never be a burden waiting to be saved. In that shared space of grief and guilt, the vast chasm between our worlds disappeared. We were no longer a mafia boss and his ward. We were just two people, haunted by the past and bound by a desperate, shared need to protect what was left of our fractured souls. The air in the small room grew thick, charged with the weight of our shared confessions. He moved, not away, but closer. I felt the warmth of his body as he stood before me, the faint scent of antiseptic, blood, and his own unique fragrance filling my senses. He raised a hand, his calloused fingers impossibly gentle as they brushed the tears from my cheek. His touch was not one of pity, but of profound understanding. He traced the line of my jaw, his thumb coming to rest softly on my lips, a silent plea for closeness that spoke louder than any words. "Fabry thinks you're my weakness," he whispered, his voice a raw, broken thing. He leaned in, his forehead coming to rest against mine, and I could feel the tremor that ran through his powerful frame. "You're the only thing that makes me feel anything at all." It was a devastating admission, a surrender of the cold control that had been his armor for so long. I raised my own trembling hand, placing it over his heart, feeling its frantic, unsteady rhythm. In that moment, we were no longer fighting each other. We were fighting the world together. Our fragile truce was shattered by the shrill, insistent ringing of a burner phone Leo had left for emergencies. Dante pulled away, the spell broken, his voice instantly reverting to its cold, hard edge as he answered. He listened, his body going rigid. I couldn't hear the voice on the other end, but I didn't need to. I saw the change in him, felt the temperature in the room plummet as he absorbed the words. After a moment of dead silence, he spoke, his voice dangerously low. "What did you say?" He listened again, then slowly lowered the phone, the silence stretching into a terrifying eternity. "That was Fabry," he said, his voice flat and devoid of all the warmth that had been there moments before. "He knows we're here. He said he enjoyed the show at the restaurant. He said he particularly liked the way I looked at you when I was describing the painting." The words hung in the air, a vile, intimate poison. Fabry hadn't just seen the attack, he had seen the connection. He knew. He knew that my life was no longer just a pawn in his game. He had found Dante's soul, and he was going to enjoy tearing it apart. Fabry's words slithered through the phone, a poison injected directly into the fragile intimacy we had just built. Dante went rigid, a statue of ice and fury. The man who had confessed his deepest wound moments before was gone, replaced by the cold, calculating strategist. He ended the call without a word and immediately began issuing commands into another phone, his voice a low, lethal monotone. The warmth between us evaporated, leaving a chilling void. Then the real blow came. It was a call from the hospital, patched through by a frantic Leo just before he was taken into surgery. He had been on his way to secure the restaurant's perimeter after the attack when a second car, lying in wait, had slammed into his vehicle. The attack hadn't just been at the restaurant. It had been a coordinated, multi-pronged assault. Leo was critical. I heard Dante's sharp, ragged intake of breath, the only crack in his armor. Then the armor sealed over again, thicker than before. He turned his back to me, speaking in rapid, guttural Italian, his words carving out orders for retaliation and revenge. I was no longer a partner in his pain. I was a piece of collateral, a problem to be managed while his world burned around him. The weight of it all descended on me, a physical pressure that made it hard to breathe. Leo, the man who had been my constant, quiet shadow, whose gentle voice had always belied his intimidating presence, was now fighting for his life. And it was because of me. I was the bait in Fabry's trap, the exposed nerve he could press any time he wanted to inflict pain on Dante. My fear of being a burden had been a pale, theoretical ghost compared to this monstrous reality. I was a walking, breathing liability, a human weakness that was getting good men hurt, possibly killed. Dante's silence was a condemnation. He didn't have to say a word. I could feel it in the way the air changed when he was near, in the stiff, controlled set of his shoulders. The man who had tended my wound with such shocking gentleness was now a stranger, his focus entirely on the war I had brought to his doorstep. I wrapped my arms around myself, a useless gesture against the profound chill that had settled deep in my bones. Every beat of my heart was a hammer blow of guilt, each one pounding out the same rhythm. This is your fault. Your fault. Your fault. The next 24 hours were a tense, silent vigil. Dante never left the safe house, transforming the small living room into a war room, a hub of hushed phone calls and encrypted messages. The air crackled with his controlled rage. It was late in the second night when he finally spoke to me, his voice rough and stripped of all emotion. He had been digging, tearing apart Fabri's network, looking for a weakness, and in the process, he had unearthed a ghost from my own past. He held out a tablet, knowing it was useless to me, the gesture a sign of his own distraction. "The trucking company," he said, his words falling like stones into the silence. "The one involved in your parents' accident 5 years ago. It was called Logistica Rossi. It was a shell corporation. Fabri just tried to use their old transport routes for a shipment." He paused, and I held my breath, not understanding the relevance. "Logistica Rossi was a subsidiary," he continued, his voice flat and dead. "It was owned by another holding company, one of my fathers. It was a Moretti asset, Alara." The world tilted on its axis, the floor dropping out from under me. The source of my deepest wound, the accident that had stolen my sight and my family, had his family's name written on it. A cold, clear rage washed over me, eclipsing the fear and guilt. It was the kind of anger that didn't scream, but froze, turning my blood to ice. My entire life, the defining tragedy of it, was not a random act of fate. It was a piece of Moretti business, a loose end, a footnote in their violent history. His protection, his guilt, his obsessive need to keep me safe. It wasn't about the break-in. It was never about me. It was about a 5-year-old debt he was finally paying. A cold, clear rage washed over me, eclipsing the fear and guilt. It was the kind of anger that didn't scream, but froze, turning my blood to ice. My entire life, the defining tragedy of it, was not a random act of fate. It was a piece of Moretti business, a loose end, a footnote in their violent history. His protection, his guilt, his obsessive need to keep me safe. It wasn't about the break-in. It was never about me. It was about a 5-year-old debt he was finally paying.
"Did you know?" I asked, my voice a whisper, but it cut through the room with the sharpness of shattered glass. "All this time, moving me into your home, telling me about your family, did you know?" He didn't answer immediately, and his silence was its own confession. "I found out tonight," he finally said, but the words were meaningless. The foundation of trust we had so carefully built had crumbled into dust. "You didn't save me from your world, Dante," I said, the truth a bitter acid in my mouth. "You just dragged me back into the wreckage your family already made of my life. I'm done. I am not your responsibility. I am not your penance. Let me go." His reaction was not what I expected. There was no apology, no explanation, only the cold, hard slam of a door locking. He saw my pain, my betrayal, and interpreted it through the warped lens of his own past trauma. "No," he stated, his voice absolute, leaving no room for argument. "That's what Isabella said. She wanted to be free of it too. I let her go, and she died. He was looking at me, but he was seeing a ghost. My legitimate, soul-deep wound was, to him, just another echo of his failure. You think leaving will protect me? You'll be dead in a day. Fabry will make sure of it. You are staying here. His words, once meant to reassure, now sounded like a jailer's decree. He made a call, and within minutes, 2 new guards were at the door, their presence a physical manifestation of my new prison. He had made his misjudgment, a fatal one. In his desperate attempt to prevent a past tragedy, he was creating a new one, shattering the very thing he claimed to be protecting. He wasn't saving me from the monster outside. He was becoming the monster in the room with me. Trapped and betrayed, I knew I couldn't stay. To remain was to be a pawn in a game between 2 monsters, one of whom was connected to the original destruction of my life. My need for independence was no longer about pride. It was about survival, about moral necessity. I had to get away from him, and in doing so, I would take Fabry's greatest weapon off the board. I began to listen, my senses stretching out into the small apartment, mapping the new patterns. I cataloged the guards' shift changes by the sound of their specific gates, the timing of the food deliveries, the subtle electronic hum of the security panel by the door. My escape came from an unlikely source. Sophia Moretti arrived the next day, her presence a whirlwind of expensive perfume and sharp intelligence. She took one look at my face, felt the suffocating tension in the air between me and her son, and understood everything. While Dante was on a conference call, she pressed a small, smooth object into my hand, a burner phone. "My driver is waiting in the alley," she whispered, her voice fierce. "He will take you anywhere. My son is a good man, Alara, but he is a fool. He is trying to cage the one thing that might save his soul. I am now in a motel room on the forgotten edge of the city, a place that smells of stale cigarette smoke and bleach. The thin walls do nothing to block the sounds of traffic and angry voices from the next room, a jarring symphony of urban decay. The freedom I fought for feels like a cold, heavy shroud. I am utterly, terrifyingly alone. Every footstep in the hall sends a jolt of panic through me, every siren a fresh wave of dread. A few minutes ago, I used the phone Sophia gave me to make one last call. Dante answered on the first ring, his voice a raw, ragged mess of fury and fear. "Alara, where are you?" he demanded. I didn't let him speak further. "I'm gone," I said, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hand. "Fabry was right. I am your weakness. Now he has nothing to hold over you. You're free to fight your war without looking over your shoulder." I didn't wait for a reply. I ended the call, removed the battery, and snapped the small phone in 2. The crack of the plastic sounded like a final, definitive break. He is in his fortress, unburdened. I am in the wild, hunted. And somewhere out there, Riccardo Fabry is smiling, knowing he has finally torn us apart. The silence in the motel room was a cheap imitation of the peace I once craved. It was thin and brittle, easily pierced by the wail of a distant siren or the angry slam of a neighboring door. My freedom was a 4-walled cage that smelled of despair and desperation, and I was the only prisoner. I knew Dante would be tearing the city apart, a force of controlled chaos unleashed by my departure. His response would be tactical, brutal, and aimed at one thing, finding Fabry. But his strategy was a blunt instrument, while I held the scalpel. The connection he had uncovered, the link between his family's business and my parents' death, was a wound I could weaponize. It was a truth that could cut deeper than any bullet. I found the number for Detective Miller's precinct, my fingers trembling as I used the cheap burner phone. I wouldn't tell him everything, not yet. I would just give him a name, a thread from the past, and pray that his jaded sense of duty was strong enough to make him pull on it. I had to believe that the system, the one that had failed me so completely, held one honest man willing to dig up a 5-year-old grave. My call to Detective Miller was a shot in the dark, a whisper of a lead dropped into the city's vast, indifferent noise. I gave him the name of the trucking company, Logistica Rossi, and the date of the accident, connecting it to my recent assault and to Riccardo Fabri. I could hear the weary skepticism in his voice, the sound of a man drowning in paperwork and corruption. But I could also hear a flicker of something else, a cop's instinct, a professional's distaste for a story that didn't add up. He made no promises, but he didn't hang up on me either. For the next 2 days, I lived on stale coffee and the ambient noise of my own fear. The city itself seemed to hold its breath. I heard it in the increased frequency of ambulance sirens, in the hushed, nervous tones of the local news reporters talking about a surge in gang-related incidents. Dante was on the hunt. His silent, grieving fury was a tangible thing, a storm gathering on the horizon, and I knew its destructive path was being carved in my name. While he waged his war with violence and intimidation, I waited for a single phone call, for a quiet fact that could bring an empire to its knees without firing a single shot. The call came on the third morning, the cheap phone vibrating against the worn motel bedspread. It was Miller. His voice was different, low, tense, stripped of its earlier cynicism. "You were right," he said, the words heavy with implication. "The original investigator on your parents' case flagged the truck's maintenance records as forgeries, but he was pulled off the case a day later. The driver who died had a brother. 2 weeks after the crash, the brother made a cash deposit of $50,000. He works as a foreman at a shipping warehouse on the West Side docks. He gave me the address, his voice a stark warning. 'Stay away from there, Miss Vance. This is out of your league. This is real.' But I barely heard him. The address, the foreman, the payment, it was the proof, the lever I needed. At that same moment, a new sound cut through the city's hum, a fleet of sirens, all converging on the West Side. Dante's war and my quiet investigation had led us to the same place. He was going there with an army to destroy a monster. I was going there with a ghost to expose one. Our separate paths were about to collide in a storm of fire and truth. I arrived before the chaos, a lone figure moving through the pre-dawn gloom of the industrial waterfront. The air was thick with the smell of salt, diesel, and decaying fish. I stood across the street from the warehouse, a vast, corrugated steel box that seemed to soak up the dim light. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, I called the number Miller had given me for the foreman, knowing Fabri would have his phone. He answered, his voice a low, amused drawl. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" I didn't waste time. "Logistica Rossi," I said, my voice cold and steady. "Forged maintenance logs, $50,000 to a grieving brother." The silence on the other end was electric. "I have the original investigator's case file," I lied, praying the bluff would hold. "I'll trade it for my life. Let me walk away and you'll never hear from me again." He laughed, a chilling, predatory sound. "Come inside, little bird," purred. "We'll negotiate." I crossed the street, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. The massive steel door slid open with a groan, and I stepped into the darkness, armed with nothing but a dead man's secret and the sound of my own unsteady breathing. The cavernous space amplified every sound, the drip of water from a leaky pipe, the scuttling of a rat in the rafters, and the confident, measured footsteps of Riccardo Fabri as he circled me like a shark. "You have courage, I'll give you that," he sneered, his voice echoing around me. "But you came to the wrong table to bluff." He grabbed my arm, his grip like iron, and I smelled the stale cigar smoke on his coat. "Dante's little pet. He drops his whole world to find you, and you just walk right into my hand. I'm not going to kill you, not yet. I'm going to wait for him to arrive, and I'm going to make him watch." Just as he finished his sentence, the world exploded. The main doors blew inward with a deafening blast, and the warehouse was filled with the roar of gunfire and shouting men. Fabri cursed, dragging me behind him as a shield, the cold steel of a gun barrel pressing against my temple. The fighting stopped as abruptly as it began, replaced by a tense, ringing silence. Across the vast space, I could feel Dante's presence. "Let her go, Fabri," he commanded, his voice a low, lethal promise.
"Drop your gun, Moretti," Fabri snarled back, "or she dies right here. Your choice. Your empire or your ghost." In that terrifying silence, I heard it, not in his voice, but in the almost imperceptible hitch in his breathing. Dante was afraid. Fabri laughed, a triumphant, ugly sound. That's what I thought. Then came a soft, metallic thud as Dante's gun hit the concrete floor. He was choosing me. He was surrendering everything. But Fabri had made a mistake. In the chaos, he had positioned us near a tall, unstable stack of oil drums I had noted by their hollow echo when I first walked in. As he savored his victory, his grip on me loosened for a fraction of a second. It was all I needed. I drove my heel down onto his foot with all my weight and threw my body backward, shoving him with a desperate, primal scream. He stumbled, roaring in surprise, and crashed into the metal tower.
The barrels toppled with a thunderous clang, and his gun fired harmlessly into the ceiling. That was the signal. Gunshots erupted, precise and controlled, as Dante's men neutralized Fabri's guards. I felt Dante's arms around me, pulling me away from the chaos, his hands frantically checking for injuries as he whispered my name. The war was over. I reached up, my hand finding his face, and I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my soul, that this was not an ending. This was where we finally began. And I hope you'll stay with us to see what we build from these ashes, because your support allows these stories of finding light in the darkest places to be told. The months that followed the storm at the warehouse were a study in a new kind of quiet. It wasn't the dead, hollow silence of my violated apartment, nor the sterile, watchful silence of Dante's penthouse. It was a living, breathing quiet, filled with the soft rustle of book pages turning and the distant, comforting hum of a city that was no longer a threat. Riccardo Fabri was gone, his empire dismantled, not by a bloody war, but by a series of quiet, strategic cuts, guided by the evidence Detective Miller had unearthed and the immense, invisible pressure Dante could apply. The name Moretti was still spoken with fear on the streets, but now it was also whispered with a new kind of respect. Dante had changed. The icy control was still there, a core part of him, but it was now tempered by a warmth that surfaced in small, unexpected moments. The way he'd place a cup of tea in my hands, remembering exactly how I liked it, or the low, soft rumble of his voice as he described the colors of the sunset from the penthouse windows, which we were slowly transforming from a glass cage into a home, filled with soft rugs, textured art, and the constant, beautiful presence of music. My own transformation found its voice in a building downtown that for months smelled of sawdust and fresh paint. It was an old, neglected music hall that Dante's legitimate construction firm began to restore. It was my project, my vision, the Vance Conservatory, a place for children who had nothing, a sanctuary where they could find a language for feelings that had no words. Dante never interfered, but his support was a constant, silent presence. He would appear at the site some afternoons, and I would sense him standing in a dusty corner, just listening to the cacophony of construction. One day, he found me tracing the intricate carvings on a newly installed doorframe. "It's oak," he said, his voice close to my ear, "with a grain that looks like flowing water." He placed his hand over mine, his calloused fingers tracing the pattern with me. "You are building something that will last longer than any empire, Ilara," he murmured, and in his words, I heard the sound of a man who was finally learning to measure his worth not in power, but in the beauty he could help create, the wounds he could help heal. He was using his strength to build, and it was the most powerful thing I had ever witnessed. The conservatory opened on a bright autumn afternoon, the main hall filled not with the ghosts of violence, but with the hesitant, hopeful notes of a child's piano lesson. My first student was a small, shy girl named Maya, whose hands trembled as she rested them on the keys. I sat beside her, guiding her fingers, teaching her the language of the music.
Don't be afraid of the wrong notes, I told her, my voice gentle. They're just part of the story. They show us where we've been. As she played a simple, delicate melody, a C major scale that sounded like the most beautiful symphony in the world, I felt a familiar shift in the air. He was here. Dante stood in the doorway, a silent guardian watching over a piece he had helped forge. He didn't move or speak, but I could feel his gaze on us, a tangible warmth that settled over the room like a blanket. The cycle of pain, the one that had started with his family and ended with mine, was finally broken. In its place, we had planted this small, fragile seed of hope, and its music was filling the silence with a promise of a better future. When Maya's lesson was over, her mother came to collect her, and the hall fell quiet once more. I heard Dante's soft footsteps on the polished wood floor as he approached, stopping right behind the piano bench. He didn't say a word, just rested his hand on my shoulder, a gesture of quiet possession and profound partnership. I leaned into his touch, my own hand coming up to cover his. The scars on his knuckles felt like a familiar map, a history I was no longer afraid to read. We had found our way out of the darkness, not by running from it, but by facing it together. He had learned that love was not a weakness, and I had learned that trusting someone was not a surrender. "Thank you," I whispered, turning my face toward his. He leaned down, his lips brushing my temple. "Always," he promised. We sat there for a long time, two survivors in a sanctuary built from the ashes, and I knew our story was just one of many. Sharing these journeys, these moments of finding light in the deepest shadows, is so important, and your support helps them reach the people who need to hear them most.